Hi everyone, it's 2:01 Eastern Time, so we're going to go ahead and get started today. My name is Caroline Hoy and I'm with Boardable. I'm so excited to talk with Dr. Joynicole Martinez today. Now, you might have seen Dr. Joynicole Martinez at a previous webinar we had last year about diversity on nonprofit boards, and we're so thrilled to have her back again today. If you are just meeting Boardable for the first time, though, I want to introduce you to the end of digging through your emails, looking for a document, board members or team members asking you where that agenda went or who's going to take the minutes. Because at Boardable, you have a central place to share documents, agendas and minute building, online voting, document storage, and much, much more. And you can sign up for a free trial at boardable.com. I do want to throw out here before we get started that we are offering a 90-day free trial, but only until the end of June. And then we're going to go to a much shorter free trial. So my suggestion is you lock in that 90-day free trial now while you still can. All right, Dr. Martinez, welcome. Thank you for coming today.
Always a pleasure to be with Boardable and with you. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. And you are in, remind me, North Carolina?
I am in Charlotte.
Welcome. I'm in Indiana. So here we are in the Eastern Time Zone, ready to get started. Okay, and we're going to talk to you all about board committees today. And we know that this is maybe not like the most thrilling topic, but it has such a big impact on your operations, right, Joy?
It is beyond your board structure and your compliance. I would say it's in the top 5 most significant parts of truly making sure your nonprofit is effective and efficient.
Interesting. Yes. And so kind of one of the things I wrote as we were promoting this was, a lot of times we have so few committees that the board members feel like they have to do everything themselves. Or on the other end of the spectrum, it's almost like we can get buried in committees where there are just so many. And it's like, do we really need all these? Are there too many? And we're going to get through all of that today. All right.
That'll be fun. I think it will be thrilling.
Good. We're bringing the sexy back to board committees, right?
That's it.
I love it. Okay. So please do enter your questions in the chat area. I know you've got some committee questions as we go along here. And so let's get started on how we can make this structure so much better. All right. So here, let's talk about some of these key questions. What are we going to cover today, Joy?
So I thought we would start with just generally what's the purpose, and then move from the purpose to how we structure it. Do we need charters or do we write in our bylaws, and what committees do we actually need, and how many people? And then key to this time and season, how do we make sure that when we are going through the process of recruiting and nominating, that we ensure that so we're going to talk about purpose and then structure and then, of course, compliance and diversity.
I love it. Yeah, and that purpose one I feel like is tricky because it seems so obvious, but I'm sure all of us have been in a meeting or on a committee where we're just like, why are we all here? Is this really something that needed to happen? Or could we have just had a document or a phone call or something about it? So I'm glad that we're going to dig into that. On that second one there, what is the difference between bylaws or a charter? I feel like I should know that, but if you could maybe just explain that one a little bit.
So when you're structuring your committee, your bylaws really tell about the structure of the organization as a whole and your board as a whole. A charter is specific to the committee. The charter structures the committee's work plan, their meeting times. It doesn't necessarily affect the bylaw, but what it should do is not stand in conflict. So your bylaw is going to be very general, and it's going to have the overview of how your organization and your board move and how they breathe and operate. Your committee charter is going to talk specifically about how that committee meets, what their specific purpose is, how many members, when they get to nominate new members, when their times and seasons are over for serving. So the charter is more specific to a committee because committees have such disparate function. The general bylaw doesn't always address or best address how the committee should move.
Got it. Okay. So the charter has to follow the bylaws, and the bylaws are above the charter.
Yes, absolutely.
Got it. And who is going to make that charter? Maybe you were planning to get to this later, but each committee is responsible for their own charter, or did someone else?
Well, it works both ways. Some committees do write their own charters. If the committee has, which we hope they do, a chair or vice, sometimes, especially if the nonprofit is new, the committee will go in and write their charter, and then that charter is presented back to the general board, your board of directors or your executive board, and then they approve the charter.
We accidentally covered Lola's question in the chat area there. So typically our committee is going to write their charter, but then they need to have it approved by the board.
Yes. Remembering that a committee is still part of the board.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's get into a little bit more of these nuts and bolts here. Here's something I found really interesting in the Leading with Intent report. I shared this with Joynicole before the webinar, and she found this really depressing. So according to this, the average nonprofit, at least of the ones that they surveyed, has 4.5 committees per nonprofit. Only less than half of those have the written charter for their committees, which is kind of shocking, huh?
Very shocking. I wonder how they're functioning well. Like I really thought, oh, well, that's interesting. I wonder how they're getting anything done.
Or are they? We don't know. I guess they didn't survey that part of it. So a majority, 76%, do have an executive committee, but only, let's see where these are broken out. Less than half have finance and audit committee, less than half have governance and nominating, and 53% have fundraising and development committees. So
that last one just really shook me. Not just because, I mean, in the nonprofit industry, fundraising and development is our lifeblood, right? That's how we survive. How do you survive without money? When you're not technically, especially in the beginning, having a cost center where you can bring dollars in. Mm-hmm. And then just from a compliance perspective, there's so much connected to your fundraising, legally, just appropriate governance. It just seems very odd to me that just above half, even when you consider that some of those are associations, it's kind of astounding that they're not separating that work out when it's so central to survival of the nonprofit.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute, which kinds of committees you recommend most nonprofits would want to consider, because that is a question I hear a lot. It's like, well, how many should we have and what committees should those be? So we'll talk about that as well here in just a second. Okay, so these are some of the different types of committees that we can have. Do you mind just talking us through kind of what each of these mean? I looked at these, and I've even worked for a nonprofit, a small one, and I was sharing with Joynicole, I'd never heard of a zero-based committee structure before. So yeah, let's just go through these and talk about some of the different types.
So we did talk about the difference between your bylaws and your charter. You know, a standing committee really, or sometimes they're called operating committees, those function on a continual basis. They are established in your bylaws, or they're usually in your board operation book or your policy manual, and they are very traditional. Your ad hoc is going to be limited in time and in scope, and it's going to address a very specific need. There maybe you have an ad hoc committee for your golf tournament, or an ad hoc committee for a specific large federal grant. So ad hoc committee is going to be limited in time and address a specific need. It may exist for a year or less, honestly. Zero-based, and I'll go back up and come back down. Zero-based really is about your strategy session. And a zero-based structure allows you to, after evaluation, start or reset your committees. And I'll give I think, good example of a zero-based structure. There's a nonprofit client that I have, and they have zero-based committees. And every year at the end of their fiscal year, as they're evaluating their staff and their goals and what they've achieved, they look at all of their committees. And the zero-based committee is established in the bylaws to say whether it's operating or ad hoc, if it's no longer necessary, we can dissolve it. So where your bylaws would have to be completely rewritten, right? If you had a standing or operating committee, zero-based says if we no longer need it, we can dissolve it without rewriting the bylaws. It allows you to continually evaluate what you need, continually evaluate what's been effective and what's working, and it allows some flexibility. Let's say if you have a gap in board members, or you've, like now, maybe you've had a stall because of a pandemic, right? So it allows you to, allows you to say, okay, we don't have to have a meeting every 2 months, or it just gives you a lot more flexibility. And I think when you look at zero-based, that ties in with having your external committee members developing task forces that may be completely outside or external to your organization, and then professional advisory councils. That kind of flexibility, and this is why I went forward and I'm going back, is why I think we have to move away from only having traditional or primary committees, because we can bring in some flexibility and some diversity in respect to diversity of thought, diversity in skill and knowledge, and diversity in all of the other demographics that we know are so significant to us being responsive to the client or the population that we're serving.
I would think too, you'd get a lot better engagement from your committee members if they're kind of transitioning out every couple of years, or that they know they don't have to be there no matter what, even if there's no business to discuss. And, it seems like it would be a lot more engaging for the participants too.
Well, and the other thing is, frankly, with all the things we're doing now, people just don't have time to spend talking and meeting, even if it's virtual, just for the sake of meeting.
Yeah.
If there's just no reason for it, and there's no time for it. And I think it's one of the things that's adding to our work weariness.
Absolutely. I apologize. Part of the joys of work from home, my lawn service just arrived to mow, so hopefully you can't hear that in the background. But anyway, I do want to remind everyone we'll be sending a replay tomorrow, so don't worry if you miss out on something. And also to please enter your questions in the chat area as we go along here. Okay, so we're talking about maybe transitioning to a more modern way of doing this with the zero-based, where we can be flexible and we can adjust to what we actually need, not just having these traditional structures where you will have this committee no matter what,
right,
and it will meet. Yes. So in the charter of that committee, is that where you're going to spell out how long the terms are for committee members and all of that kind of?
So you would do it both. Your bylaws should establish that you have a zero-based committee structure. And then for me, in my experience and according to my expertise, you should also include your term limits in your bylaws. And I say that because there's always the person who sometimes has to be gently reminded that they have to actually come to a meeting. And then there's the one that has to be gently reminded that their time is up. So again, the bylaw being your legal structure, you want to make sure that it's in your bylaw, that we are zero-based, and that in the charter it's repeated that this is what we've decided for, and it's in the bylaw and they can refer back to it.
Interesting. Okay, so let's go back to, we were talking there about the zero-based and we did traditional, so the diversity aspect of it is something we need to consider too.
So we talked about this in our last webinar together. When we talk diversity, especially now, we get stuck, right? We get stuck on the race and ethnicity question. But diversity, especially when you're talking about governing a board or operating a business, is so much more than just what we look like. It comes from our experience as professionals, our family experience, our educational experience. And we have to have a way to bring diversity in that addresses diversity of thought, right? And diversity of skill. So yes, we want to make sure we have women, that we have men, that we have white, black, purple, polka dotted, right? That we have lawyers and financiers. All of those are, I guess, statistical things we want to include. But I want to make sure that we're talking about diversity in the sense that we come together and the input that we're receiving on our committees is diverse. And that only happens if you have moved away from everyone on your board and in your committee looking, thinking, feeling, and haven't had the same experience.
That makes a lot of sense, especially on the committee level, because we're trying to draw recommendations to give to our main board, right?
So if your finance committee only has people who work in banking, you're going to get the same outputs, right? They're pretty much going to have the same experience. They may have the same educational background, but they certainly have the same professional experience. So the problem becomes, if there's a financial question or recommendation or an issue, it's easier for them, yes, in some sense, to come to a response. But do you really want the general recommendation from that committee to solely be based from people who work in that industry? Or do you want diversity? Do you want someone to say, wait, I have a question, or maybe we should explain that better? Or perhaps our committee could do a better job of ensuring that we're looking at things that our finances beyond just the numbers, how, and other questions that, are significant, not just the what are we spending it, how, and to what point, and to what purpose. And is that good for us in the company, or is it good for our client? Those questions typically come when we have a little bit of conflict, which is fantastic. I know it sounds crazy, but it's fantastic, because in conflict, when we learn to deal with conflict by having crucial and complex communication, that's when diversity becomes really valuable and the committee really starts to fulfill its purpose.
Love it. Okay, and then we're going to talk a little bit too about external committee members, task forces, and advisory councils.
So it's under diversity because that's where we start to get some of those gaps filled. A lot of times nonprofits, just the board is not large. Let's say you do have a large grant you want to go over, and you want to make sure that you're responsive to it. It requires a lot of moving parts. Rather than just the consultant, which please get a consultant, but rather than just the consultant, you may establish an advisory council, a grant writer, an evaluator, an auditor. You may look at someone who's been funded before, just bringing in the diversity, again, of thought and experience. So, but you can disband it or dissolve it as soon as that grant application is over. So this is not a standing committee. And then the other thing is, some people are great with respect to a specific event or purpose, but they don't make great board members. So you may have an event coming up, and there's a great event planner who is fantastic at connectivity and raising funds and connecting people. Very busy, very drawn in different areas. So not a great board member, right? But wonderful for just an ad hoc external committee that's dealing with this event. So I saw a question that said, if you don't have zero-based in your bylaws, can you add it? Absolutely. You can add it as an addenda to your bylaws. Okay, minimum number of board members if the state doesn't have a minimum. I would say that depends on your nonprofit. If you're establishing a nonprofit, and this answers for LaDawn Jones, if you're establishing a nonprofit, then the minimum would mean that you have your president, your treasurer, your secretary. You need someone who can record your legal documents, someone who's over the finance, and someone who serves as the executive of the board. That's the minimum. I don't suggest that you continue that way if you are, especially as you grow. But if you're asking bare minimum, that's the bare minimum I think you absolutely can have legally. Committees are part of the board, but their real role is to do the research and recommendation to the board. So why their charter is so specific and why it's no necessary is because the committee's role is really to step away from the board meeting or the board operation, use their knowledge, skills, and their abilities to come up with a recommendation for a specific item or operation. So if you have a nominating board, that board's responsibility is to walk away, use the bylaws and their charter to determine how we nominate and who we nominate, and then bring those recommendations for persons and processes back to the larger board. So what it does is it makes the board more effective and efficient. Their purpose is not to usurp the board. Their purpose is not actually to make the final decision. And I think most people don't always understand that. The committee's purpose is not to make the final decision. The board itself is responsible. They have that responsibility. They're the fiscal, they have that fiduciary responsibility, not the committee. So the committee is going to do the research and then make a recommendation so that it's conducive to policy, procedure, and operations. That is the committee purpose.
Okay, and I don't know if you covered this while I was having my technical difficulties, but do we typically want to have a board member in each committee, or can they have no board members and just make recommendations?
No, you absolutely must have a board member on every committee, even if it's an external joint task force or a advisory committee. You absolutely want a board member because, again, fiduciary responsibility falls to the board. And so to make sure there's cohesion between the communication, and we'll talk about that reporting, because these reports, these minutes, this is still a part of your legal record, your operations legal record, and can be called upon anytime, like any other part of your legal record, right? So you absolutely want to make sure there's a board member on every single committee.
Yeah, that reminds me of one of the questions I saw in the chat, and I don't know if you've answered this already, but someone said, I've heard the argument that creation of certain committees tends to relieve the rest of the board from responsibility over a certain matter. How do you ensure that a committee does not become solely responsible for a task when it really should be the responsibility of the whole board?
Right. Again, that's why your charter has to be very clear that says this committee is to research and make recommendations. And we'll go forward and talk about their work plan. The work plan with the charter together ensures they are not attempting, intentionally or not intentionally, to usurp the board itself.
Mm-hmm. I could see how that could happen if you get some overbearing people on some of your committees who might think they know better than other people or something like that.
Or, sometimes what happens is you do bring in experts who are first in their field and they know what they're doing and they're on a committee and they're being effective and they're getting it done and the recommendations are great. And the board kind of goes, well, good. And they kind of go hands off. The problem with that, though, is Again, final fiduciary responsibility falls to your board of directors. So the committee, by bylaw and charter, it's not, if something does, forbid it, go wrong, you're still responsible as a board for that committee's action.
That makes sense. Okay, and then did you already speak to the last bullet there on temporary specific tasks related to an event or goal?
Right, that really speaks more to your ad hoc or your joint task force, or sometimes people bring in a professional external advisory committee. Those specific tasks may be the only purpose that committee has.
Mm-hmm. What are some instances where you wouldn't want an ad hoc committee? Are there certain things that shouldn't be done in that sort of temporary manner?
Absolutely. I think when you look at operational or standing committees, the reason why they're not ad hoc is because the work is ongoing and because there's such weight to their work. For example, your finance committee, of course, we know they keep track of your assets and liabilities. You do not want just like an ad hoc committee dealing with your finances, right? They're going to prepare an annual budget. They're making recommendations. They're answering questions about the financial report at every board meeting. And so that's on your agenda and it's in your minute in your record. They have oversight of most contractors and consultants. They oversee endowments, right? So these are not things you want ad hoc.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's go to our next slide here and talk about some of these structure tips that you have for us. Bylaws and committee charters must be carefully crafted to ensure the committees serve their intended purpose. You know, we touched on this a little bit, but do not exceed authority.
So I think when we look at charters, and we probably repeat this later, but I do have some charter templates and examples, and Caroline will share them, and I'm sure she'll send them out. But when you're looking at your charters, you want to make sure, again, the wording is such that it always refers to the bylaw as the guidance document, and that it clearly sets out the purpose and when that purpose ends. So that kind of keeps us from going a little bit crazy on, so I'll give you an example. Let's say you're having a fundraising event, but you have a finance committee. The fundraising event committee, their purpose doesn't exceed the finance committee's work. Even though they're having a fundraising event, their purpose has to be very specific. And then the functionality that deals with the finance that happened as a result of that fundraising event falls back to the finance or fiscal committee. So that's why they have to be very carefully crafted. This is not something you want to just do on a whim or not make sure you've reviewed and that everyone's had a chance to ask questions and that everyone really understands what the charter and the bylaws say. So there's no conflict between them.
Someone asked in the chat, can you talk about, should committees have minutes? And we're going to get into how they report a little bit later, but if so, do they have to be as detailed as board minutes, or can they just be a summary of discussion and action? We can save that one for a little later if you want to talk about that all at once, but I guess we would spell all that out in our charter too.
Yes, absolutely. That's going to be all of the operation, when you meet, how you meet. For example, can you meet virtually? One of the things I find in a lot of nonprofits is they've never gone back and changed their bylaws or charters to say we don't have to get together.
Oh no.
We'll meet at headquarters, and then they go, oh wait, can we have a virtual meeting? Like, is that something we can do? So again, being sure that how you operate is listed in the bylaw and the charter. We can come together, but if you want to be able to vote electronically, you need to spell that out. You have to say that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We talked about that in a previous webinar. People are having to do provisional votes remotely.
Right.
And then, have a written record of it, whether it's email or whatever. And then whenever you do get together next time, sort of revisiting that and making sure everything is amended as necessary. Okay. And charters should focus on specifics, keeping the team nimble and responsive to changes. So all part of that as well. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about some of your favorite standing committees.
I'm going to touch on Mitchell Archibald. I'm going to touch on his question, and when we're talking about this, I want to touch on James Kane. He asked about onboarding and orientation. So standing committees, absolutely, you must have orientation. And the reason being, typically your standing or operating committees are such that they have a vast amount of responsibility and the work is ongoing. And they need to know exactly how that work is done, exactly what the purpose is, how they are effective, by what measures they're determined to be effective or efficient, and that they've reached their goal. So yes, onboarding and orientation, absolutely key when you're talking about standing or operational committees. Nominating and governance, for example, you want to make sure people understand the vision of the organization, and all of these, of course, how we're nominating people to the board, why we're nominating them, how, why, who, how frequently, when you're looking at finance and risk, what kind of skill set they should have, what kind of knowledge base they should have. When you're talking about communications, you want to make sure that those people have PR, marketing, even media experience, fundraising. Again, for me, in my experience and expertise, every board member has a responsibility to bring resources to the organization, every single one.
Absolutely.
It's a sad thing when people join a board and they forget, so to speak, that they're supposed to bring money to the table. That's just what happens. So you have a fundraising standing committee, and you want to make sure those people are not just understanding finance, right? Not just understanding capital and nonprofit spending and budgets, but you also want to make sure they understand, like the finance and risk, is that fundraising has to be conducive to the purpose and the stated legal purpose of the organization. Because you'd be surprised how many people come up with fundraising, but the fundraising isn't aligned with the stated purpose in the bylaw and organizing document. And that is especially a problem when you've had an older nonprofit that maybe changed their focus over time. And they just haven't gone back and relooked at what they're doing. So for these standing committees, which if I were just going to start off base, I would make sure that these were the ones that I had, that we were recruiting and we were governing well, that our finance and risk was maintained. And this even includes, talking about your taxes. And we could spend another hour just on finance and risk. Your executive committee is made up of people on your board. The executive committee typically is your organization executive, your board chair, and the chairs from your various committees. They make up your executive committee. A lot of nonprofits don't establish communications as a operational committee. I think this is error, especially now when we consider we talk all the time.
Yeah.
Not just within ourselves, but social media, marketing messages and cohesion in our messaging is so important. And then communications and fundraising are so interlinked. It is hard not to have an operational committee, I think now, that deals just with how we communicate, what we communicate, and how we do that in a way that we are saying the same thing across all of our media.
So if you were a new or young nonprofit, which of these do you think is the first or second that you would want to establish?
5.
All 5 of them. Okay.
I mean, you could have your executive committee and finance and risk. You could start there. Even if you don't start a nominating and governance committee, you want to make sure that you're evaluating again every 6 months to a year that you're in compliance with your, federal and state policies, procedures, and that you know how you're getting people on the board. If you don't really know that, if you don't have a plan for that, and that's part of what that committee does, is they establish the plan for bringing people to your board, bringing experience, bringing resources in. So if I just had to start with you, of course you'd have to have the executive committee and then finance and risk, I would hesitate to not include nominating and governance.
Okay. That's good to know, because I know a lot of smaller, newer nonprofits feel a little overwhelmed by all of this. But I mean, really, the whole point is that it makes the board's work easier to have some, research done for them, recommendations made. They don't have to do all of that themselves at every board meeting or whatever.
Right. Because ultimately, imagine how much easier it is if you have something coming up when you have board members of your association, consultants, funders, community representatives working together on some program development task force, right?
Mm-hmm.
If it's just your 5 board members, it may take you 6 months to come up with an idea, chew through it, send out surveys. If you have a task force, you're going to get through that process if you communicate well, right? And if you have a good charter and you have a work plan, you'll get through that process not just easier, but you'll also get through that process with input that's so valuable that just the 5 of you could not have come up with alone.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, we're going to divide and conquer in this instance.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So we talked a lot about standing versus ad hoc. Standing committees, I think maybe, yes, are needed on an ongoing basis. Ad hoc committees, temporary, set up for a specific event or goal and dissolved when completed. Do we need to have a charter for ad hoc committees too?
Do you have to have it? Dr. Joynicole says yes, you have to have it. Again, your charter is going to make sure that you're working, not just working well, but that you're working in compliance. And nonprofit compliance you just can't function without it. So there should be a charter for every committee, no matter what type, whether it's a standing, ad hoc, task force, external, advisory. There should be a charter because it lays out the rules for how they operate in compliance with the bylaws and your state and federal law and policy, and it makes sure that people are able to be held accountable, because again, we're dealing with humans, right? And we're imperfect. So we want to be sure we can hold people accountable to the tasks and the goals.
Okay. Let's see. I see Kaylin is asking about bylaw templates. I'll see what we have in our resource library. If we have something that's relevant to that. I know, that's a big question for people, so we'll see what we can find out there. Okay, let's keep going then. Committee work plan and operational goals. So how can we've got whatever committees that we're going to have right now, all 5 of those, as Dr. Joy insists. And how are we going to run them, and how are they going to report and be useful to us, right?
So the best way to make sure that you're doing this is a work plan. So you have a charter. The charter lays out the operational functionality, right? The work plan says this is our operational goal. So the charter is the function, work plan is the goal. And this is how we ensure we're effective. It lays out a plan. It lays out the plan, lays out the strategy, lays out a timeline. So this is how we're going to get this done is our charter. What we're going to get done, how we're going to get it done specifically, and then when, by when. Because committees, again, what you don't want is when you come together as a board and you're going through your committee reports, you know that one committee that's always like, well, we met, or well, we didn't meet. We still didn't meet. We're working on getting a meeting. Or you get the ones that we met, but we couldn't come to a decision, or we're still trying to. So you need to be sure you have goals and timelines. Again, your charter can say, okay, well, if they haven't been able to reach these goals and timelines by a specific time, we either have the wrong members, we need to reevaluate. See, so a work plan is critical to making sure that your committee is effective. And the bane of committees is not just that they don't always have a timeline, but that they don't understand how their work ties in with the overall work or strategy. So just like any employee, right? If you're in HR, you know, everyone should feel somehow connected to the vision. Everybody, from the president to the, I don't know, the pencil sharpener. Everyone has to really clearly see how their work ties into the purpose or the vision. It's the same thing with the committee. They need to understand how their work ties in with the vision and the ultimate goal, and how it does it based on your strategy planning session. So your strategic plan should line up. This committee's work plan should line up with your strategic plan.
Okay. And then this work plan, is that we're going to make that within the committee as well, right? Where that's not being dictated from somebody else.
No, it comes from the committee, because once you've gotten together, you want to make sure, okay, well, if there's 3 of us on this committee and we know Wednesdays just don't work for us, well, we know that we're not going to put goals for Wednesday, right? We're going to make sure that our goals say that we're going to meet Friday. And we're going to meet twice a month on Friday, because we just can't meet any other time, because every other Friday, one of our board members has to take their kids to soccer, right? So our timeline is stretched out because we have all these other things. So this is done in the committee because it's very specific. It's an operational plan that's specific to the membership of that committee.
Okay, that makes sense. So they're going to set out the best way for those individuals to work together as well.
Right.
Okay. Let's go on to our next one here. How are these committees going to report out all this wonderful work that they're getting done in an efficient way that doesn't make everybody crazy when they're sitting in a board meeting with half of it being a committee report?
So they're going to get Boardable.
Yes. Right? All the documents in there and just...
So remember, reports are a communication tool, right? That's what they are. You know, they're a legal tool. Yes. They are a legal document. Yes. They are kept for historical and recording value. Yes. They can be called upon for response to legal questions. Yes. But ultimately, they are a communication tool. Your report should actually say something. I know that's crazy to have to say. But you'd be surprised how many times people just type up a report and they really don't say anything. They just say, we had a meeting, this was our agenda. But it doesn't tell you what actually happened. Did we actually hit everything in that agenda? If we did, what came of it? It doesn't have to be that you do a report. So here's the thing. Typically, standing committees submit at every board meeting. Other types of committees, they should be really flexible on how they report. If it's, you know, every month, year, or if it's based on when they've met a goal or objective.
Makes sense to have that time.
Right. So your standing or operational committees, when there's a board member meeting, they typically report. But the other types of committees, I mean, if they're not meeting every month, why ask for a report every month?
That's a good point.
Then you just have that part in your board minutes that say committee, you know, no report, or, you know, stands up and says, we have nothing to report. I mean, that it doesn't, you know, be flexible with everyone else. And even be flexible with your operational or standing committees, especially now when we're not coming together physically. And be flexible in the sense that they're reporting, it's a communication tool, but you can send that communication tool prior to the meeting.
Yes, get a consent agenda, which our board governance coach here, Kim Donahue, is always preaching about.
Good gracious, why people wait until the meeting to actually give out information, I will not understand. But it's a communication tool. Communicate constantly. Let the information and documents be available so that if you do come, when you come together, the questions are rich, right? You'll get a richer discussion if people have had access to that information prior to the meeting.
Yes. So what I know Kim suggests is we circulate our committee reports with the agenda. So say 5 to 7 days before the meeting.
Right.
And then during the meeting, you just say, does anyone have any questions on the committee reports? If not, we'll approve them and move on.
Right.
Love that. I think a lot of people would be relieved to have that kind of a flow in their meetings.
And again, we're working to make sure that we're valuing people's time, right? Yes. And that we're being efficient. And so with the 4,000 other meetings we have to have, I don't really want to go through your 10-page report word by word. Yeah.
Everything everybody said in that committee meeting.
Really don't want to do that.
Okay. Makes a lot of sense there too. And then the purpose of these reports, it's a communication tool. And so these are the things we might want to accomplish with that.
So, you're informing the board, you're tracking progress, sparking discussion. Another reason why you need to make sure it's been sent out before. You want to make sure, again, that consistent messaging and marketing. And then truthfully, part of the report is to instill pride and to get enthusiasm. I mean, boards should not be boring. I know that seems counterintuitive. if it's like killing you to serve on the board, please step down. I mean, it's okay. If you're not invigorated by the work and it's just draining you and you don't feel any enthusiasm about it, you are not going to be effective. You are not going to help us be productive. You are not ultimately going to help us reach the vision. So the report is not just, again, the legal document. It's so that we can say we're on track, we're moving forward, and so people can feel good about that. So it shouldn't just be minutes.
Yeah, that's something that I think bears reminding, because there are probably a lot of people out there who forget committee meetings or reports should be kind of exciting, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Yes. Okay, we're almost to our time here, so I'm going to ask you to keep entering your questions in the chat area, and also to remind you that we'll be sending out a replay. Let's talk about the contents of our committee reports here briefly. What do we need to be telling the board?
So, the first 5 are just your header, just talks about, the date, name, who's the chair, who's on there, what you're doing. You want to talk about what you've achieved. You want to talk about your progress for things you haven't yet achieved. And you want to tie that to the finance. This is especially significant because people don't always remember, again, like I said before, the work has to be tied to the vision, right? So you want to make sure that you're tying in your work to how it's connecting financially for this nonprofit or for your association, right? Then if you have dissenting opinions, it is fine to state them. Oh. Not everyone's going to vote yay, right? This is especially significant in your standing committees. In your operational or standing committees, when you have a dissenting opinion, especially if it's a big question like hiring a firm to do your Yellow Book audit. If there's someone who says, "Hey, I'm going to get outvoted here, but I just want to write down, I want to state my reasons for not going with this company," it's okay to include that. It doesn't reflect poorly. What it says is, there's been some thought, some conflict, there's been some input and real conversation. This was our final decision or recommendation, but we had some real engagement here. And then your recommendations, whether it's to your CEO or executive or it's to the board itself.
All right, so we're just going to identify kind of where we are, what we need to get to the next place, financial impact, and then those recommendations and opinions. Love it. Okay, and then external committee members, task forces, and advisory councils, building diversity and filling KSA gaps. Tell us a little about that.
I know we've touched on it, but I just want to say it 1,000 times again. It is so important that we're bringing in people, thought processes, advice, experience, and expertise that fill the gaps we can't fill. One of the nonprofit industry is burnout.
Yeah.
You see it frequently. People are burnt out there. You see burnt, and I saw Sharon wrote, she finds herself micromanaging. You know what happens? You have usually they're not as competitive with the salaries and the benefits as the for-profit companies, and so there's a lot of work being done by few people. It's just, we're working on it, but it happens. What you want to do is bring in people to hire everybody, right? You can bring people to make sure that you have not just diversity, but that you have skill and knowledge and expertise. When you don't know, it is the wisest thing to bring in someone who actually does. It doesn't matter if you don't know it. What matters is if you continue to function without the knowledge being in the organization.
Interesting. So we're going to supplement things that we might not know how to do with our committees and in the diversity, more importantly, on those committees. If we just have people like us around, then we all know the same things.
You'd be surprised how many times people form committees and, you have a board member who's on 4 committees. If you're not limiting that, that's a problem. But B, they're not changing from one committee to the next, right? They're the same person. So their input is going to be the same. And if they have a conflict on one committee, they typically will have a conflict on the other, have another one. So what you do to make sure that you have diversity coming in and that you have filled those gaps, you simply bring it to yourself. You say, hey, I can't be a board member. Would you mind sitting in this task force? We're working hard to make sure we're responding to whatever this climate is. This, the political climate, Karen asked KSA, a KSA is knowledge, skills, and some people say, people say attitude. For me, the A, typically I use the A to say your knowledge, your skills, and your assessments, because assessment can deal with whether or not you're talking about your actions, your attitudes, your activities, all those gaps. You want to fill gaps that you may have for them.
That makes sense. Scholarly knowledge, skills, and other aptitudes or attitudes.
Attitudes, assessment, all of the A's that make us that we use. We evaluate ourselves based on them, right? So we have gaps because ultimately I can't know everything. No one's an expert at everything. Nobody. But I can make sure that doesn't lead to a failure to function well by establishing an external committee or a task force or an advisory council. Do not be afraid to bring someone in. You don't have to put them on your board. You don't have to give them fiduciary responsibilities, but you can use them. And I mean that in the most positive way. You can use them to make sure that you're functioning well and that you have access to the information and the experience and knowledge that they have. And remember, boards are only as good as their diversity. You can slide ahead, Caroline, it's fine. Okay. They're only as good as their diversity. And so that's in any organization, any company, you're only as good as the people who are there. So no matter if you're doing it through a small group, you're standing, you're ad hoc, your advisory council, the evaluation is so important. You have to not just evaluate what you've accomplished. You have to evaluate how long people have served, who has served, if you still have gaps that you need to fill, is your governance and your governance structure, are they in line with what your new vision and your new role and your new purpose is? You know, do our committees work? Because ultimately, sometimes they just don't work. The truth is, we have boards all the time who don't get things done, not because the people don't want to, it's just they don't have the right skill set coming together, the right people coming together. So they keep having meetings and then nothing happens.
Yeah.
Right? No resolution happens. So you have to evaluate. And I must say this in every training and every webinar, evaluation is key. Because evaluation is what we use to make sure that we're actually being effective. So you cannot just put people on a board. You cannot just put people on a committee. And you cannot just add external people to your committees without regularly looking at whether or not the committee is necessary, whether or not there's enough people, whether or not it's functioning and meeting its goals, and then ultimately, if it's helping the organization grow.
Yes. So we don't just keep having these meetings and committees that aren't achieving anything forever.
Because people are tired.
Yes,
They're just tired.
do that. Oh, I agree. Okay. Well, before we get to your final Q&A time here, I just wanted to tell you next month about our webinar with Camila Brown Washington. It's called Get a High Performing Board in Boss Mode. Boss mode refers to board organization and strategic systems. So she's going to talk to us a lot about how to clarify expectations of our dream team, how to get them more engaged with fundraising, how to identify and recruit the people who can actually help us fulfill these goals. So you can find that registration in the email that we're going to send out of the replay. Save the date next July. Okay, and Dr. Joynicole Martinez, let's get to the last questions we have here. Sharon asks, and I know this was one I wanted to ask you too, how many people should we have on these committees typically?
Minimum 3. I would say no more, if you're a large nonprofit, no more than 8.
Okay.
Again, it's a committee. It's a smaller structure that reports to a larger structure. Large nonprofits, you know, you're talking about a board of 12, 13 people, maybe 15 if you're pushing it. If for an advisory committee, I think that depends on the purpose of the committee. So if your committee's purpose is a fundraising event, you probably need more advisors because you want to look at the event itself, use, and then marketing, communications, you know, and networking. So maybe that's 4. But if you're looking at an advisory committee for like your finance committee, you may just need 2. Just maybe a CPA as part of your advisory committee, and perhaps an auditor or someone who has vast experience in nonprofit or yellow book auditing. So I think it depends on the purpose of the committee, how many people you may want to have on an advisory committee.
And part of that probably plays into our diversity piece where we need to just, if nothing else, be sure we cover the skill sets that we need for each committee too.
Which is why, again, the charter is so important, and why recruiting your board is so important. Because if you're starting right away, our goal is to just bring in funds, then that board committee is going to be crucial to your ultimate and immediate goal. So your advisory committee, you want to find people who have knowledge, skills, and they have depth of experience who can help you do that. So how you recruit to your board, will lend to how you recruit to your committee.
Interesting. Okay. I know this is something that I see in a lot of webinar topics we have. How do we approach our board members to create some of these changes? Like, let's say we want to go to more of a zero model. How do we kind of get everybody to buy into doing this better?
So I will say board socialization is so important. and your executive committee can do this. When I say board socialization, I think when you're talking about change and change management in general, introducing the concept, the change concept before the meeting is very important. Socializing it, whether that's through your staff, your C-suite staff or your high-level managers and leaders, making sure your board understands why this is important to your organization long before you ask for the change. So socialize your board.
Yeah.
How if you have relationship maps with your board, internal relationship maps, meaning you have someone in your C-suite that's comfortable or has some type of relationship with someone on your board, leveraging that and saying, hey, why don't we have a meeting or have a sit down, have a coffee, have a virtual coffee with, Jim, and just see what he thinks about this. And let's just try to socialize him on the idea, his feedback, before you just throw a change at your board in the middle of a board meeting, which never works out.
I was just thinking, yeah, that it seems like kind of, I don't know, maybe not common sense, but the impulse would be just to bring it up in the meeting, like, what do you guys think about?
Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that. Yeah. I mean, get their thought by socializing the concept long before, and then, and then the next thing after you socialized it and you kind of have an idea that maybe they at least understand why it's going to help your organization, is, use your technology, have a chat, have an email thread, get in your Boardable portal and just talk about it. Just talk about it outside of the board meeting. Just talk about it. Answer questions. Give them a chance to kind of chew on it a little bit. And that will make your board meeting better. And it also will make sure that they're buying into the change and they're buying into whatever new thing you're introducing. And then ultimately you need an evangelist and a champion on your board.
Maybe share this webinar.
There you go.
Somebody that you want to be your champion on the board. Yeah, I love it. Okay, let's see. I know we mentioned, I saw earlier on in the webinar before my connection cut out, a lot of people, while virtual right now, are having to switch from event fundraising to grants and having to kind of pivot committees that might not be used to doing that kind of thing. Can you speak to that? I know that's a little bit off topic here, but I remember you saying, get a consultant.
Yes, get one, please, God, get a consultant. If you have depth on your board and they're familiar with grant writer environment, so when you're talking about your board committees and you're pivoting from maybe just, if you're used to having dinners or events or balls or galas or golf tournaments, and now you're finding you can't do that and you have to do more specific fundraising based on grant applications, you really want to make sure that if you don't have that depth in that fundraising committee, you want to get an advisory council set, pull in committee members, set up a task force. The task force will help you pivot well. Because what happens is you can have a plan for, okay, the task force plan how we make this pivot in a way that doesn't damage us or unfortunately, damage us more deeply.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you get a task force. The task force may be that committee. Once the task force makes their recommendation, you may find you have to then move to an advisory council who helps you accomplish what the task force has laid out. And those may be people.
Okay. Let's see. We've run over our hour here. I see some people having to bow out, like William. Again, don't worry. We will be sending a replay tomorrow. Dr. Joynicole Martinez from the Alchemist Agency, I'm so grateful for you being here today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
We will be sure to include some of those resources you mentioned that you have available in our replay email so people can use some of those templates and checklists and things that we can provide. So we will get right on that. And thank you to everyone. I hope you learned a lot today, and I hope to see you next month as we talk about how to get that high-performing board going. Okay, have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.